Hello and welcome to my presentation on created kinds. My name is Todd Wood. I am president of Core Academy of Science. We're headquartered in Dayton, Tennessee. And my research throughout most of my career, more than 20 years now, has focused on this issue of created kinds, what they mean, what they are, and so forth. So I hope that I am able to explain to you today what I've been doing and that you will benefit from what I have to say. So let's get started. So I'd like to begin here with this idea of basically biological similarity. And I've shown you here on the screen an image depicting a lot of different cats from around the world. Lynxes and jaguars and tigers and lions and so forth. And despite all of their different appearances, you can look at this, and even a child can look at this and recognize that common something that's sort of like a cat, right? You can detect as you look at these things that there is what I called before a catness to them, and it's you can see it, right? Now, when we're thinking about this sort of similarity, Charles Darwin argued that the reason things are similar is because they are all related to a common ancestor. The reason all the cats share those traits that you can see that unite them together in their family felidae, the cat family, is because at one time there was only one cat, one species of cat that eventually diverged and diversified and became many cats. And the reason your cat looks kind of like your dog and different from, say, your lizards or your salamanders or whatever, is because there is another ancestor back there that is the ancestor of the cat and the dog, and so on and so forth, all the way back to the very beginnings of life when whatever it was emerged from the warm little pond that it emerged from. Now, the Bible has some things to say about created kinds that are a little different, and the origin of life is different, right? So in Genesis 1, we read these things. God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. Now, some things to note here in this passage. The plants, the creeping things, the swimming things, the flying things, the wild animals all have separate origins, all within a single week. So we don't have the emergence of all of these creatures over billions of years from a common ancestry. We have essentially a finished ecosystem at the end of creation week. Now, within those broader groups, then, creatures are made after their kind. That gets repeated over and over again, and that's where the idea of the created kind comes from. When we talk about created kinds, we're talking about that phrase that occurs so often in Genesis 1. And it seems, the passage itself seems to emphasize differences rather than similarities, right? So you have the difference between the plant, the creeping thing, the swimming thing, the flying thing, the wild animal, and so forth. They're not all lumped together. God doesn't say, "Let there be life," and there was life. It is, in fact, different groups that seem to be distinct between them rather than simply similar and grading into one another. And so if you think about Darwin's evolutionary tree, perhaps what we might be thinking about instead is a giant forest, where we could look at certain species today and say, yeah, I can imagine those two things being related by some kind of ancestor. But they're very different from other things. And in that respect, then, maybe what we should be thinking about is not just ways to analyze the similarity of species, but also ways to look at their differences. All right, so this is pioneering creation researcher Frank Marsh. He finished his doctorate in 1940, and he self-published a book called Fundamental Biology in 1941. And this is where he established a couple of ideas that would really stick with creationists throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. He established this notion of hybridization only within the created kind. We'll talk about that here in a second. And he coined the word Baramin to describe created kind. Baramin comes from the Hebrew term bara, meaning to create, and min, the other Hebrew term meaning kind. I'm told that we should actually, if it was good Hebrew, we would invert the order of those things, but it's an English word now, so Baramin. We use Baramin in a sort of technical sense for created kind. All right, so Marsh's main claims. The first claim was that when you read after its kind in the book of Genesis, what you're reading about is a biological law of reproduction. And I can't find that in the text. There's nothing really there that the Bible does not say that creatures were created to reproduce after their kinds. That's usually how it's quoted to me. That's not in the scripture. It's possible that you could read the description of the creation of plants that way, but it doesn't really say anything about the animals. It doesn't really say anything about, the wild animals or the creeping things or the flying things or the swimming things. So my judgment on this one is that he's wrong. He's wrong that that's what the Bible is saying. He could be right about his biological law of reproduction, that you can only produce offspring with another member of the same created kind. But it wouldn't be because of what the Bible actually says. And so based on this idea of the biological law of reproduction, that you can only produce offspring within a single created kind, that two different created kinds cannot produce offspring. In other words, when you cross them, they cannot produce offspring. He deduced from that any successful hybridization then must be between members of the same kind. Okay? So in that respect, that could be right. He could be right about that. That's his hybridization criterion, and he might be correct. This is something that we would have to test. So let's give some examples here of what we're talking about. One example, very easy example, the mule. You've seen mules before. They're a cross, first generation cross between a horse and a donkey. One parent is a horse, one parent is a donkey, and you get a mule. They are different from either parent, and they're a cross between the two species. And I find these sorts of things just endlessly fascinating. The idea that you would get crossing like this, that two different species would be capable of producing this hybrid offspring, I think is really very interesting and really, honestly, kind of surprising that this would happen. And then we have another one. You've seen the mule before. Have you ever seen a zonkey? This is the hybrid offspring of a zebra and a donkey, called a zonkey. And it turns out, if you look at all the different species of horse and donkey and zebra that we have living in the world today, that every possible cross is known. Okay? Every possible hybrid has been produced. They can all cross with each other. And so Marsh would say these things, because they can all produce offspring, are all related to the same created kind, that they are all part of the same Baramin. Now, that's really cool when it works. But what about when you have two species that don't produce offspring? What happens then? Well, in that case, it's not clear what to say about them. Marsh allowed for the idea that, hey, there could be changes since creation that just make two different species of the same created kind not really fertile anymore. They can't really produce hybrid offspring any longer. And so if you can produce a species, that definitely means you're in the same created kind. But if you can't produce a hybrid offspring, then that doesn't mean that you're not in the same created kind. You just don't know. So that's a bit of an annoying little quirk of this, right? Another limitation, it doesn't work on asexual organisms. There are many, many creatures in the world today that do not reproduce in this way, that can produce hybrid offspring. They just don't make babies that way. And so for those kinds of creatures, you cannot make claims based on hybridization. You cannot infer created kinds. Now, some people might argue maybe there aren't created kinds for those kinds of creatures, and that could be true. It doesn't, this text of scripture doesn't mention anything about fungus or bacteria, anything like that, the sort of asexual organisms. So I suppose it's possible that the idea of the created kind just does not apply to those creatures. But that is definitely a limitation. It'd be hard to even explore the question of created kinds within asexual creatures because they don't form hybrids. It doesn't work on fossils. And if you know anything about, the creation evolution debate, everybody wants to argue about what fossils mean and what they're all about, and are they evidence for evolution and so forth. And so there's a lot of creatures out there that are really interesting that we would like to be able to say, well, this belongs to this created kind and not to that created kind. But we can't say that because they're dead, right? We can't make hybrids from them because they're dead. So we need something other than just hybridization. And then there's practical problems. There's the whole problem of it's just difficult to do this in general, right? Unless you have someone who's interested in keeping these species. If you put them in zoos, the zookeepers are generally going to want to maintain the species and not cross them. So you'd need some sort of private collector or private breeder. And then it gets really dicey, right? If you want to know the created kind of bears, for example, yeah, who's going to make bear hybrids? That strikes me as difficult. And it's hard to justify on rare or endangered species. As I said, zookeepers are going to want to keep species separate. They're not going to want to hybridize them. And if they have an endangered species in their collection, they're not going to want to just cross it willy-nilly with any old species they can. So there's limitations to this hybridization idea. Even though I think it's really interesting and really provocative, it doesn't really cover everything that I would, as a biologist, would like to study using the created kind idea. And so that led in the 90s to the development of this notion of baraminology. Sort of a broader perspective on studying created kinds. And yes, it is a Hebrew word stuck onto a Greek suffix, and I know there are a lot of word files out there, who don't like it when this happens, but it's an English word now, so we're going to do it anyway. This was developed in the late 90s, early 2000s, because my colleagues and I just wanted something more general that we could use, for example, in fossils. And so we said, yeah, hybridization is really interesting and it can work. When it works, right? You could conceivably identify created kinds when it works. But there also was needed to identify this idea of discontinuity. So this is Frank Marsh again, and this is from his book, Evolution, Creation, and Science. And he says this, a point which we are very sure of is that equal with the fact of diversity is that of discontinuity. Organisms cannot be found grading gradually into the other. We recognize men, apes, dogs, horses, oak trees, wheat, and roses. So his notion here is that there is not this evolutionary tree, right? You don't see perfect transitions between every group alive. Instead, what you find are these discrete groups that you can recognize. They're different from each other. We need to be able to evaluate not just similarity, but differences, right? And so I kind of emphasize that when I mentioned, what Genesis has to say about the origin of life. And I said, look, there's these differences. They seem to be very interested in differences, like things that swim and things that fly. So, how do we go about studying this? Well, this was the big question that we had at the time. So what we thought we could do was to make a list of characteristics. Take a group of species and make a list of the characteristics that they have. Some of which you might notice are unique to particular species or particular small groups of species, others of which might distinguish a group of species from another group of species, and so forth. You make a big long list. And then you would compare two creatures simply by calculating the number of characteristics by which they differ. And in this case, we would make a kind of a distance. We called it a barometric distance, but really what it is a simple matching coefficient, if you're familiar with that. So it's a simple matching difference, is all it is. And then we repeated that for this whole set of creatures, set of species, that includes what we think is a created kind, and then also species that we thought were not members of that kind. And this is the important bit right here. It's always important to include these other things that we think are not that created kind, because then you can evaluate the discontinuity, or maybe you can, and identify what groups are different from what other groups. And that's a really important ingredient that I think that this Baraminology work brings to the table. And then we simply ask whether these barometric distances exhibit evidence of significant similarity or significant difference within the sample of species. So let me give you a quick rundown of how this might work. This comes from a paper, actually a pair of papers that I published 2018 and I believe last year in 2021 on mammal Baraminology. And here's bears, right? So here's an example of some of the characteristics from this group of bears, and we see height of lower canines, and we've scored them according to the species of black bear, giant panda, or dog, and so forth. And then we have molar enamel. Is it rough or is it smooth? And zygomatic arch, the cheekbones, are they narrow or are they wide? And the chin, is it curved or is it angular, and so forth. And you can see that there are certain things that are common, right? So the curved chin is common to everything. The molar enamel is rough on the black bear and the panda, but is smooth on the dog, and so on and so forth, right? And so the idea here is that you would make a long list of these things, as many as you reasonably can, and then figure out what percentage of characteristics do each of them differ by, right? So take the number that they have in common and just subtract 100%, and then you figure out the percent that they differ by. Distance is mostly because that's what these sort of clustering algorithms use to sort of figure out what things belong to the same cluster. So here's a result from the bears. In this case, the blue dots are all species of bear, both from the living world and from the fossil record. And then the red dot over there on the right is the dog, Canis, or the wolf. So yeah, it's interesting. The dog here is quite a bit separated, neatly separated from the bears. That's interesting. The bears, however, do show quite a lot of diversity, right? There seems to be this group of bears over here, and this group of bears over here, and this group of bears over here. There could be multiple groups of bears, and that's, I think, a reasonable thing for us to be talking about as we move forward in studying bears. So this is just our first approximation. But based on this, I sort of concluded, yeah, the bears look like they might be a created kind. Another example here, this time the bunnies. There are lots of species of bunnies. They are members of the mammal family Leporidae. There are 54 species of bunnies, and they are found all over the world. You can see a couple of examples of the different species here. You can see the short-eared white fur on the Arctic hare, and the long ears and sort of tawny fur of the jackrabbit, and so forth. So there's lots of different bunnies around the world. Now, the nearest thing to a bunny, the the most similar creature that there is to a bunny is called a pika. And this is a pika. This is, you can see the smaller ears. They don't have the bouncy back legs. They are distinct from bunnies in that way. And they're members of family Octonidae. And there's not very many of them in terms of species. Now, if we were to take their characteristics and use them to create an evolutionary tree, you would come up with something that looks like this. Now, the white taxa there are all known from the fossil record. They are other sorts of creatures that are kind of like bunnies and pikas, but are not really obviously either one of them. Then in green, you have the pikas, and in sort of orange there, we have the bunnies. And we can take the very same characteristics here and use those characteristics to analyze the similarity and differences. And when we do that, this is what we find. Now, this is, in my opinion, quite interesting, right? So the orange dots again on the right here are the bunnies. And then the green dots over here are the pikas. They are quite distinct. They form definite clusters that are separate from one another. And then the other fossil forms are also separated from either of the clusters. Now, so based on this, I concluded the bunnies are probably a single created kind. And it's possible, again, that I'm wrong. It's possible that all of these fossils and the pikas and the bunnies are all members of a single created kind that are distinct from some other fossil creature that we know about or don't know about. Yeah, that's possible, and in the future that would be something that we would continue to research and continue to learn about. But at this point, this is what I've concluded based on my initial research into the bunnies. Now, some people might say, what about ancestry? Don't people usually talk about created kinds in terms of things that share a common ancestor? Well, sometimes they do. But that's something that I think we would have to think about after we do our work to actually identify the created kind in the first place. And some of them, like the black dots here, I've drawn so that the ancestry is all back to a single root, right? So maybe we might say that animals that survived the flood all share a common ancestral pair that came off the ark. And so they all go back to a single root. Whereas maybe over here the white dots represent some creatures that survived the flood outside of the ark, some fish or whales or something like that. And so maybe they don't go back to a common ancestor. We just don't know about that, right? We don't know, reading the creation account, whether all creatures started off with an ancestral pair, right? Like human beings did, or whether there were multiple members of the created kind already present at creation. We just don't know. We know the earth wasn't full because God told them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every created kind started off with just two. We don't know. So I've left the possibility here for whales and plants and other things like that did not survive on the ark. Maybe they don't go back to a single ancestor. Maybe they go back to a very similar set of ancestors that were created. It's a good question. Now, another example here that I think is really important for understanding this issue of ancestry and this issue of created kinds is the horses, right? So I've already shown you the horse hybridization information based on the Zorse and the Zonkey and the mule and so forth. And we said that horses are probably a created kind. That's all the living forms, right? But there's other forms of horse that you've probably encountered in textbooks. And this example goes all the way back to T.H. Huxley. In 1875, he visited the United States and saw our horse fossils and decided this is a great example of evolutionary transitions, right? And so he published this diagram in a lecture on horses, showing you the changes in horses as he imagined that they evolved into modern horses. And that diagram is still very similar to the ones you can find on Wikipedia today. Back when I made this slide in 2007, and it's still the same. All these years later, 15 years later, it's still pretty much the same diagram because people are still talking about the evolution of the horse. So this is, an evolutionary tree showing you the relationships of the horses. From up the top there, the earliest horse is Heractherium, and various other horse names that go down. And, as down here at the very bottom, we have Equus, which is the actual genus of horse, the group of horses that we have today. And so there's this gradual emergence and diversification of horses in the fossil record. And again, remember, we can take all that data and make our own analysis of it. And this time I've analyzed it in multiple different ways. And I have some colleagues now who are trying to repeat this work as well. And what I found was really interesting. I didn't get neat clusters, although one could argue that maybe I have a cluster here and a cluster here and a cluster down here. Maybe. I suppose you could try to make that argument. But it sure looked to me as though I had one really long sort of linear cluster, which is not usually what you see when you do this. Usually I get either clusters or a cloud of a mess, really. It doesn't really look much like anything. But this looks like a line with a little branch off it, right? So here's the line, right? And there's the branch. And it looks exactly the same way in different methodology. You can use different methods to create this diagram, and you'll come up with roughly the same distribution, which, again, that's quite fascinating. And here's the even more interesting part. You take that evolutionary tree, and the order of appearance of these different horses in the fossil record matches pretty close to what you see on the evolutionary tree, which then matches pretty close to what we saw in this multivariate analysis. So what do you do with that? What should we make of that? I thought it was pretty remarkable myself. I concluded, hey, there's more than 175 different species of horse in the fossil record, along with the handful of horses that we still have alive today. The evolutionary tree matches the stratigraphic record, the order in the fossil record, which matches our multivariate analysis. So I just said, well, it looks like all of these species then must have descended from a common ancestor. They were members of a single created kind that came from a common ancestor on the ark. That has been mildly controversial, I would say. And I'm certainly open to the possibility that we're wrong about that, right? It's, again, this is one study, and we need to continue to do research to either confirm or correct the work that we've done. So another example here pertinent to this is the whales. Here we have representatives of two groups of whales. On the right, the killer whale representing the Odontoceti, which are the toothed whales, whales with big sharp teeth. And that includes dolphins and sperm whales and killer whales and all of those guys. And on the left here, then, the humpback whale, which represents the Mysticeti, which are the baleen whales. And there's not very many baleen whales. And they all, them because they have these enormous mouths and these what looks like big combs in them that hang down, and they filter feed. That's basically how they get their food. And so they're distinct enough to be in these separate groups. Now, evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould wrote this about the whale fossil record. During the past 15 years, new discoveries in Africa and Pakistan have greatly added to our paleontological knowledge of the earliest history of whales. The embarrassment of past absence has been replaced by a bounty of new evidence, and by the sweetest series of transitional fossils an evolutionist could ever hope to find. Okay, what's he talking about? He's talking about things like this. This is Archaeoceti. Okay. It is a fossil whale. We know this largely from the shape of the inner ear. It's very similar to modern whales. So yeah, this is a whale. But you'll notice here, down here, is this, they look like hind legs, right? They look like hind legs. And in fact, that's what Gould is talking about. He's talking about an entire range of fossils that we know from the fossil record that seem to show the appearance of legs on these creatures as they develop more and more aquatic lifestyle. Okay, so what can we say about that? Well, I analyzed this in a similar way using the statistical methods again. Now, this is just one example. I've got other examples where I get more detailed into these creatures we call Archaeoceti, these creatures that look like four-legged whales. But here in green, I'm showing you the evolutionary tree. We have land animals here in red. We have the Archaeocetes in green. They do appear at the base of the whales, is where you would expect them to be. Then blue is the baleen whales, and yellow is all the toothed whales. This is mostly, again, focusing on living species, not necessarily on the full diversity of fossils. But again, I have other studies that show similar results to this one. Now, this is the multivariate analysis showing you the existence of really, really clear clusters, right? So we have a cluster of baleen whales down here in blue that's very significantly separated from the Archaeocetes over here and from the toothed whales. Now, the toothed whales seem to show some different clusters within that group. I concluded there's probably 5 different groups of 5 different created kinds of toothed whales. But probably only one created kind of baleen whales. Now, again, does that mean that all toothed whales, the toothed whales evolved from a common ancestor, baleen whales evolved from a common ancestor? Maybe. I don't know. We're not given that information. We're not given enough information in the creation account to know how these creatures started out or what they started out as. So it's possible that the diversity we see today could be some of the diversity that existed when God created, or it could be that we have new species that have developed over time. So my conclusions on the whales: the tooth and baleen whales are separate creations. The Archaeocetes are not actually, well, I suppose you could call them whales, but they seem to be quite distinct from whales. I thought they might be related to a group of creatures known as mesonychids. There's some disagreement about that. The whale fossils turn out to be really complicated. That's okay. We can continue working. But here's the really interesting part. So here's 2 examples of evolution that get repeated and shown all over the place as clear examples of creatures that evolved and made major transitions in the fossil record. So I see that the horses that start out as horses and end as horses, that could be a real transition. That could be a real development, or at least all members of the same created kind. I could see that. With whales, though, I'm not sure that's correct. I am not sure. I don't know. I'm skeptical. Certainly looks to me like there are multiple created kinds of whales, although, again, there's still more research that needs to be done. So, more research that needs to be done. What are some of the outstanding questions here in the study of created kinds? Well, one question that I think about is, does this mean anything, right? And the problem here is that I can pick a list of characteristics to show clustering of any kind that I want. Any kind that I want. I can put humans and ostriches in the same cluster and show that they are significantly different from mushrooms, right? Does that mean anything? Now, my answer to that question so far has largely been, well, we need to explore that further. And so I've sort of thrown out this idea that maybe there is something unique and special and interesting about the discontinuity that separates created kinds. And again, I call it the discontinuity hypothesis. It is a possibility, right? It might be true based on what I have observed in some created kinds. So it's possible, I imagine, that you could have something really interesting and unique going on at that particular level. And then the question is, well, where do we think created kinds are? Well, maybe they're not, it's not species because they hybridize. It's not between different genera, different genus of the same creature because they can also hybridize often. So the next rank up is kind of family. Hybrids between families are pretty unusual. I don't hear a lot about those. So think about a hybrid between a cat and a dog. That's not, you wouldn't think that would be possible, right? So maybe that's where it stops. When I come down from the other side, thinking about the description of creation in Genesis 1, I see big groups like things that live in the water, right? So whales, for example. And then things that creep as opposed to the wild animals, as opposed to the domestic animals. And so I'm sort of getting into the world of maybe orders, maybe families somewhere around in there. So maybe that's where we should look. And so that was my suggestion. And I've been trying to do tests of that hypothesis for some time now. I tend to be optimistic about the results, but I don't think we really have enough information to know that yet. So does this mean anything? Great question. And the jury's still out. We're still working in these areas trying to learn more about this, even as we try to make interesting claims and interesting analyses of the fossil record and try to draw some interesting conclusions from them. Another question. How do we test this, right? So I got this group of things that I've done my statistical stuff on. Can I test that in some other way? And this is an area that I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in the idea of, can we use DNA sequence information? Can we use genomic comparisons? Can we use some other analysis of the fossil record? Are there other ways to look at created kinds? And this is the important thing. Do they all converge on the same created kinds? So if I came up with a way to look at the DNA of creatures and said, all right, well, here's cats. I've said based on the analysis of the fossil record, cats are a created kind, family Felidae. Do I see that same created kind in the DNA? Do I see that same created kind in whatever analysis of the fossil record I do? And so on and so forth. Are there other ways of testing this? I think that's super important for us as we move forward in this area. And of course, as I mentioned again, can we then look at genetics, DNA, genomes, and so forth and make sense of that with this idea of the created kind? And again, yeah, that's an interesting question. It's an interesting question that there have been a lot of discussion of. I don't want to say that there's no work in this area. There is quite a lot of work going on. And I'm interested in seeing where it goes. Again, I feel like the jury is kind of still out on this one. We're still sort of deliberating and thinking about how we would use genetics to study created kinds and what genetics might mean in the light of created kinds. If there are created kinds, what does it mean that we have genetic similarity between things that are not actually members of the same created kind? And then, of course, that brings me to this big question of why are created kinds similar? So I mentioned that archaeocetes are not whales, right? Yeah, well, that depends on what you think a whale is, right? A whale, as it turns out, is a group of multiple created kinds, we think, based on the research we have now. So what does that mean, right? What is a mammal? One of the first things kids learn, oh, dolphins and whales are not fish, right? They're mammals. And, I can see it. They have the internal anatomy of a mammal. They're warm-blooded, they breathe air, their organs are all mammal organs. It's pretty obvious they're mammals. But what does it mean to be a mammal? Now the evolutionist comes along and says, well, it means that they share a more distant common ancestor. Once upon a time, there was only, a handful of mammals that diversified and diverged and evolved and became whales and aardvarks and people and rats and cats and so forth. And to me, that seems to be ruled out by what the Bible describes as the creation of creatures in the beginning of Genesis. So if that's true, then these categories that we see must be part of God's intentional design. And some people would say there's really no reason to speculate about that, but I don't know why that would be. It seems to me that if God has put all of this similarity out here for us to explore and learn from, well, then we must be able to learn something from it. So the question is what? What does it mean? So lots of questions here still to ponder, but, to think back over what we've seen here today, I think there's really a lot of interesting stuff going on in created kind research. I'm excited about it. I'm excited about the possibilities of using, baraminology to study these interesting evolutionary transitions and try to see what they might really mean in terms of creationism. And I'm really privileged and glad to be able to share this work with you. If you'd like to learn more about my ministry, Core Academy of Science, please visit coresci.org/connect. That will take you to web links to our social media. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can find out about interesting articles that we think you should read to learn more about our work. And you will also learn more about our podcast, Let's Talk Creation, which is recorded and released every 2 weeks with Paul Garner, my co-host. It's really popular. People like it. It's a great opportunity to learn more about creation. And yeah, we do talk about created kinds from time to time. So please check that out. Thank you for your listening. And I'd be happy to entertain questions.